Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest secrets of Viking life. Not their raids, not their battles, but the bizarre rituals that governed sex. Rituals so strange that being accused of breaking them could ruin your honour, start a blood feud, or even get you outlawed. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing just how far across the world these sleepy voyages stretch. Bonus points if you're from Norway. Now, dim the lights, maybe pull up a blanket and let the background hum carry you along. Tonight, you've just woken up in a Viking longhouse. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're pressed against two other people, one of whom is loudly snoring, while a goat chews hay a few feet from your head. Privacy is a foreign concept here. You can hear every cough, sneeze and sigh in the room, and unfortunately the same is true when it comes to intimacy. Your bedding is a heap of furs that smell like wet dog and smoke. The fire pit in the middle of the longhouse fills the air with heat, but also with a constant haze of ash. The smell clings to your skin and hair until you wonder if you'll ever be clean again. You shift, and the floor creaks. That's when you realise everyone is listening. Because in a world where honour and reputation mattered more than romance, what you did in the furs wasn't just private business, it was a community spectacle. Here's a fact. In Norse society, being accused of being argia, unmanly or passive, could destroy your reputation. It wasn't just an insult. It could spark lawsuits, feuds, or even exile. Entire families went to war over whispered accusations about what happened between the furs. Imagine your personal life being as legally dangerous as losing a duel. To make things even more awkward, fertility rituals often spilled into public life. Wooden and stone amulets shaped like exaggerated anatomy were carried as charms. Crops were sometimes blessed with symbolic unions. You realise this is less romance and more agriculture. Love wasn't private, it was communal, magical, and occasionally agricultural. And here's the kicker. If you thought magic was a way to escape the awkwardness, think again. Cider, the sorcery often linked to women, sometimes carried sexual undertones. A man practicing it risked humiliation, even outlawry for being seen as too passive. Yet some still dabbled, desperate for visions of the future or power over fate. You picture the smoky rituals, the herbs burning, and the uneasy silence when someone suspects sorcery of the intimate kind. As you shift uncomfortably in your Viking bedding, the goat coughs, the rafters drip condensation, and you realise that romance here is less about passion and more about surviving judgment, gossip, and the ever-present smell of salted herring. And if you think fertility charms and honour-based insults were strange, just wait until you find out how Viking law handled affairs, and why breaking the rules of the bedroom could be more dangerous than losing a battle. And while you're still reeling from the idea that your personal life in the Viking Age was everybody's business, it only gets stranger when you discover how obsessed these people were with fertility. Not romance, not affection, but the ability to produce children and, in their minds, the ability to keep the crops alive. In a world without modern science, everything from childbirth to barley harvests needed a push from the supernatural, and that push often looked like something straight out of a very confusing adult cartoon. You wake in the smoky longhouse, and the first thing you notice, besides the ever-present scent of salted fish and unwashed wool, is the presence of charms dangling from belts and hanging over doorways. Small carvings of exaggerated male anatomy made from bone or amber, worn as pendants to ensure fertility and ward off evil. They were carried into the fields, buried in the soil, even tucked into the bedding. You realise with growing unease that you're surrounded by what amounts to a society of people who wore good luck charms shaped like body parts. Archaeologists have uncovered these amulets across Scandinavia, proof that fertility was not only a matter of survival but also of social pride. And then there were the rituals themselves. Fertility feasts often involved the slaughter of animals, particularly horses, whose blood and organs were believed to bless the soil with life. At these gatherings, drinking bowls of mead were passed around, and fertility songs were chanted with the same gusto you might hear at a modern sporting event. The difference is, instead of cheering for goals, they were cheering for conception and harvest. You cannot help but imagine the awkward silence if someone's voice cracked mid-chant, ruining the rhythm. The point of all this was to bind the community together in a shared promise of survival. The humour, of course, is that the Vikings truly believed symbolic actions mattered. A farmer ploughing the first furrow of spring might have his wife ride the plough naked to encourage the earth to become fertile. To the Viking mind, this was practical magic. To your modern mind, it is a mental image you will never forget. But this is what happens when science is a rumour and superstition is the rule. The land was alive, the gods were watching, and the human body was both tool and symbol. It was not only farming that got this treatment. Fertility charms extended into family life. The sagas describe men placing carved talismans in the bed before lying with their wives, believing this would increase the chances of sons. Sons, after all, were the key to wealth, inheritance, and political alliances. A daughter might bring a dowry, but a son could bring warriors. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your success in life depended not just on your own performance, but on whether the gods approved of the little figurine on your nightstand. The more you study this world, the more absurd it becomes. Viking weddings themselves were saturated with fertility symbolism. A bride carried an ancestral sword to her husband as part of the ceremony, representing the transfer of family honour and, more bluntly, the power to create heirs. Feasting often ended with the couple being ushered into the bridal bed, while guests made ribald jokes at their expense. Privacy was considered not romantic but suspicious. After all, what was the point of marriage if not to produce children for the clan? In that sense, Viking society would have considered your modern concept of intimacy a little too secretive for comfort. And then there is the role of magic. Fertility rituals were not just about objects or feasts. They often involved seeresses, women who practiced cedar, a form of sorcery. These women might chant over the womb of a pregnant woman or bless a field with incantations. But for men to take part in such rituals risked humiliation. The Norse considered cedar effeminate, and for a man to be accused of practicing it was to risk being called Arga. The irony is delicious. The same men who depended on fertility rituals to secure their lineages also feared the magic that supposedly made those rituals effective. You're beginning to understand the absurd tightrope these people walked. On one hand, fertility was sacred, survival depended on it, and everyone took part in the symbolism. On the other hand, being seen as too eager, too involved, or too submissive in these practices could destroy your reputation. You picture the longhouse feast, the smell of roasting meat, the sound of mead horns clinking, and in the corner, a nervous farmer pretending not to look too interested in the fertility charms dangling from the rafters. The archaeological evidence confirms the intensity of this obsession. Graves from the Viking Age often contain fertility symbols buried with the dead, suggesting people carried their anxieties about reproduction and survival into the afterlife. Imagine lying for eternity with a carved talisman by your side, as if to assure the gods that you were still committed to keeping the family line going, even while 6 feet under. And the strangest part is that all of this was communal. Fertility rituals were not whispered about in private. They were sung, carved, acted out, and celebrated in groups. The smell of blood from sacrificed animals, the chants echoing through the hall, the flickering light of torches. It was spectacle. It was ritual theatre. And you, as a participant, had no choice but to play your part, even if your role involved holding a charm shaped like something you would rather not display publicly. As the fire crackles and the mead grows stronger, you realise there is no escaping it. Every part of your life in the Viking Age is tied to fertility. Your reputation, your family's survival, even the quality of your bread harvest. You feel the weight of expectations settle on your shoulders like the thick smoke pressing down from the rafters. You're surrounded by rituals you barely understand, and yet you're expected to believe in them as fiercely as everyone else. And just when you think it cannot get stranger, you learn that the laws themselves had something to say about intimacy. In the Viking Age, insults about your private life were not only dangerous in the hall, They were punishable in court, which means that your reputation in the bedroom could be decided by a jury as easily as by your neighbours. Your uneasy place in this world becomes even more precarious once you realise that intimacy in the Viking Age was never just between two people. It was also between you, your neighbours, and occasionally a court of law. Viking society believed that honour was fragile, and nothing shattered it faster than a sexual insult. What you did in private was everyone's concern, and if someone even suggested you were unmanly or unfaithful, the consequences could spiral into something far more dangerous than gossip. The sagas describe insults as lethal weapons, sharper than steel. To call a man Arger meant accusing him of taking a passive sexual role, which was considered shameful. It was not a playground taunt. It was grounds for violence, even bloodshed. You picture the smoky longhouse, the mead hall full of laughter, and then silence when a careless joke crosses the line. A single word could spark a chain reaction of challenges, duels and feuds that left families fractured for generations. The absurdity is striking. An axe to the chest might be survivable, but an insult about your honour in bed could exile you forever. There are even legal codes that make this official. The Icelandic Gragas, a medieval law code, spells out punishments for sexual slander. Accuse someone falsely of being a passive partner, and you could owe them compensation in silver or face outlawry. Imagine your intimate reputation being weighed and judged as carefully as a property dispute. Your honour was currency, and the courtroom was as likely to hear cases about whispered rumours as about stolen sheep. The humour, of course, comes from the contradictions. Here was a warrior society obsessed with toughness, yet the most dangerous insult was not about cowardice in battle, but about bedroom roles. You could lose a duel, survive raids gone wrong, and still keep your standing. But one badly timed accusation about your love life, and you were socially ruined. You cannot help but see the irony in a culture where swords were less deadly than sarcasm. And it was not only men at risk. Viking women, too, were subject to scrutiny, though their situation carried a different weight. The woman accused of promiscuity faced shame, legal disputes, or abandonment. Marriages were political as much as personal, and accusations of infidelity could collapse alliances. The sagas tell of wives publicly insulting husbands by questioning their potency, turning domestic squabbles into matters of clan honour. Imagine a world where your partner's late-night grumbling could be treated with the seriousness of treason. The setting only heightens the absurdity. You're in a longhouse with thin walls, packed bodies, and no privacy. Everything you say carries, and everything you do is noticed. If the goats hear you, your neighbours probably do too. In that atmosphere, silence is suspicious, and noise is dangerous. A misplaced sigh could be fuel for rumours, and those rumours could end up before a court. You realise you're not living in a home so much as a stage where every performance is judged. The legal system went further still. Viking law punished adultery severely. A man who discovered his wife with another could demand compensation, or take vengeance, depending on the circumstances. Adultery disrupted family lines, inheritance and alliances, and that made it dangerous. The punishment varied from fines to exile, but the message was clear. Break the rules of the bedroom, and you risk breaking society itself. The sagas even hint at ritualized shaming. Neighbours might carve mocking runes on doors or spread satirical verses, turning someone's reputation into a public joke. In a world without paper tabloids or social media, poetry served as the weapon of choice. To have your intimate life immortalised in verse was a humiliation that could last centuries. Archaeologists have found runestones with cryptic messages that may have served as warnings or accusations, proof that even carved stone was not above being used as medieval graffiti. You cannot escape the fact that every action is public property. The mead hall is noisy, smoky, and filled with eyes. Children, elders, warriors and slaves all crowd together in spaces where secrecy does not exist. You hear the coughs, the laughter, the low mutters of judgment. You smell the mead on the breath of those whispering. Your body feels heavy, not from the furs, but from the crushing awareness that your reputation depends on how everyone else chooses to interpret your private life. It is both terrifying and hilarious to think that in this world, sex was never simply physical. It was legal, political, and social. The absurdity lies in the seriousness. Imagine your private frustrations being entered into legal records alongside cattle disputes and land rights. To the Vikings, it made sense. Honour was everything, and honour extended to every corner of life. To you, it feels like a nightmare version of reality television, except with higher stakes and fewer commercial breaks. And just when you are convinced this obsession with honour cannot get worse, the sagas remind you of the rituals designed to prove fertility and faithfulness. The longhouse is thick with smoke, the benches creak, and the air buzzes with unspoken tension. You know what comes next will not be private, and it will not be gentle. The longhouse is never silent. Even at night, when the fire pit burns low and the torches fade, the sounds of a dozen different lives echo around you. Someone coughs, someone snores, the goats shuffle on the far side of the wall, and when couples turn to one another for intimacy, that sound joins the nightly chorus as naturally as the crackle of the fire. The problem is, there is no separating yourself from it. Privacy is a modern invention. For the Vikings, the longhouse was a communal machine, one open room where life, death, and everything in between unfolded in plain sight. Archaeologists know that most longhouses were between 15 and 75 metres long, depending on wealth and status. But no matter the size, they were built for groups. Families, slaves, livestock, and honoured guests all packed together, sleeping on benches lined with straw and furs. The smoky rafters were never clear, the air always thick with sweat, food, and the stench of animal dung that seeped in from the byre. Into this setting, intimacy was not private. It was semi-public, happening in corners, under blankets, or simply ignored in the background while others pretended not to hear. The result was a world where sex was less of a hidden act and more of a community soundtrack. The sagas do not flinch from this reality. They describe insults hurled at men for being overheard performing poorly, or women mocked for being too loud. Imagine your private life dissected not by gossip whispered behind closed doors, but by neighbours who were literally only a few feet away. You may think your walls are thin today, but at least they exist. In the Viking Age, you were always within earshot. And then there were the rituals that made things even more public. At weddings, guests sometimes stayed in the hall until the couple were formally ushered into bed. In some cases, witnesses were required to ensure the marriage had begun properly. The symbolism mattered more than the privacy. To the Viking mind, reproduction was a duty owed not just to the couple, but to the entire community. So when two people disappeared beneath furs, it was not just for themselves, it was for the future of the clan, and everyone had a stake in it. The awkwardness is staggering. It is the equivalent of your entire extended family cheering as you head to the bedroom and then waiting to make sure you do not disappoint. The archaeological record adds texture to this picture. Excavations of longhouses show clear divisions between work areas, sleeping benches, and storage, but no evidence of private rooms. Wealthier chieftains might have partitioned spaces, yet even these were more symbolic than soundproof. Curtains woven from wool or linen offered little protection from noise. A couple's attempt at privacy would have been muffled at best, laughably inadequate at worst. You can almost hear the shuffle of feet on straw and the quiet smirk of a neighbour pretending not to notice. It was not only weddings that created this public intimacy. Ritual feasts sometimes blurred the line between fertility symbolism and actual physical displays. Animal sacrifices, fertility songs, and drunken celebrations often slid into bawdy humour, where innuendo was as common as ale. In this world, the boundaries between sacred ritual and communal entertainment were paper-thin. What modern people might consider obscene was, for the Vikings, just part of the feast. One particularly strange tradition mentioned in later accounts is the practice of insulting or praising newlyweds in verse. Poetry was the Viking equivalent of a social media feed, only carved into memory instead of posted online. To have your private life celebrated in song was a mark of honour, but to have it mocked could haunt your family for generations. Verse was powerful, shaping reputation in ways that swords could not. Imagine being remembered not for your raids or your wealth, but for how loudly you performed in bed. The communal longhouse meant children were witnesses as well. Growing up in this environment meant absorbing adult realities early, with a little attempt to shield young ears. Scholars suggest that this normalised sex in Viking society, making it less secretive but also less romantic. It was not about passion, it was about duty, survival, and reputation. To live in that world was to live without the luxury of privacy. Your bed was not your sanctuary, it was part of the village. The absurdity lies in how normalised it was. No one seemed embarrassed because no one expected seclusion. You, however, feel the weight of it pressing in. The smoke scratches your throat, the furs itch, and every movement feels amplified. You hear laughter in one corner, a sigh in another, and you realise there is nowhere to hide. This is intimacy in the Viking Age, a communal performance you did not volunteer for but cannot avoid. And when the morning comes, the consequences linger. A smirk from a neighbour, a muttered joke at the well, or worse, a satirical verse recited in the hall. Your private night is now public property, immortalised in memory. The hall smells of stale ale, ash and sweat, and you know the gossip will smell even worse. This is the reality of Viking life. Rituals, feasts and legal codes all tied together in a web where sex was never private and always subject to judgment. You can almost feel the claustrophobia of the longhouse closing in, the rafters dripping with condensation, the floor littered with straw and ash. There is no escape, and yet the community thrives on it. In their world, this lack of privacy was not a flaw. It was tradition, it was culture, and it was survival. And just as you begin to think you have adjusted to the suffocating closeness of it all, another layer of ritual awaits. The rituals of oath-taking, ordeals, and humiliations that tested not only your reputation, but your very body in ways that could terrify even the most battle-hardened Viking. The smoke in the rafters stings your eyes and your body aches from another night on straw. But what unsettles you most is not the discomfort. It is the awareness that in this society, intimacy can be tested, judged, and even put on trial through rituals so strange they blur the line between theatre and torment. For the Vikings, suspicion was not left to chance. If questions about fidelity or honour arose, there were ways to prove yourself, and none of them were pleasant. Trial by ordeal was one of the most dramatic. Though more commonly associated with medieval Europe, evidence suggests that Norse culture had its own variations, blending law, superstition and humiliation. A common ordeal across the broader medieval world was plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron to prove innocence. For a Viking accused of sexual misconduct, the ordeal might not be the same, but the logic carried over. Pain and spectacle were proof, because the gods themselves were expected to protect the innocent. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were vindicated. If they festered, your guilt was obvious. Imagine the horror of proving your private virtue with third-degree burns. Oaths were equally binding, and the gods were not to be trifled with. In a society that worshipped deities like Freyr, associated with fertility, and Freya, linked to love and magic, swearing falsely about intimacy was seen as inviting divine punishment. You might be asked to swear an oath on a sacred ring kept at a temple, a heavy band of gold or silver touched by countless hands before yours. Place your palm on it and deny the accusation, and you are safe. Lie while doing it, and you risk angering the gods. In the Viking imagination, this did not end with a guilty conscience. It ended with crop failure, sickness, or disaster striking your household. In other words, your love life could doom your entire farmstead. The sagas record public shaming rituals that bordered on cruel performance. Accused adulterers might be mocked in verse, with bawdy poems recited in halls to humiliate them. Poetry had power, and insults carved into rhyme could destroy reputations permanently. To be satirized for infidelity was worse than to be beaten. Your name, your honor, your household all became punchlines. The hall would echo with laughter, the smell of ale strong on the breath of your mockers, and your humiliation would outlast the feast, because sagas had long memories. It did not stop there. Archaeological finds hint at rituals involving symbolic acts to cleanse or confirm innocence. Some accounts mention women accused of infidelity being forced to undergo public questioning, often with neighbours present to testify. Imagine the sheer awkwardness of standing in a crowded hall while elders asked probing questions about your private life, and you had no choice but to answer under the weight of dozens of stares. Privacy was gone, replaced with a ritual that turned your body into public property. Even accusations of sorcery carried sexual undertones. Men accused of practicing Seder risked humiliation because it was considered effeminate. Yet, if suspicion arose, the rituals of proof often revolved around emasculating imagery. Public mocking, ritualized verse, and in some cases exile were the consequences. The paradox is absurd. The same society that depended on magic for fertility and prophecy condemned men for practicing it, creating a culture where rituals tested not only honesty but masculinity itself. The role of religion in all this was overwhelming. Fertility deities were central to Norse life. The cult of Freyr, for example, involved rituals with carved idols often described in embarrassingly explicit terms. Accounts from later Christian chroniclers describe processions where statues of Freyr, complete with exaggerated anatomy, were carried through fields to bless crops. Whether these reports exaggerate or not, the symbolism speaks volumes. Viking society tied sexual imagery directly to survival, and rituals of fertility were both sacred and shockingly public. You picture the villagers marching behind a wooden idol, while chanting for the earth to bear fruit, the smell of freshly turned soil mixing with the sweat of the crowd, and you cannot decide if you are witnessing worship or parody. It is here that the absurdity crystallizes. To prove faithfulness, you might swear an oath before gods who demanded nothing less than total honesty. To defend honor, you might endure pain or humiliation in front of your neighbors. To secure the harvest, you might march behind a carved phallic idol, while chanting blessings into the wind. Every ritual carried the weight of survival, but also the heavy stench of communal scrutiny. The sensory assault of it all is impossible to ignore. The hall is smoky, the floor damp, and your body still sore from straw bedding. The noise of gossip hums in your ears. Your mouth is dry from cheap ale. You watch as another ritual begins, a woman swearing innocence before the ring, a man nervously laughing as a poet recites a mocking verse, the air heavy with both amusement and judgment. You realize that Viking life blurred the line between sacred and obscene, between survival and humiliation, and yet the system worked. Reputation was preserved, fertility ensured, and community order maintained through these rituals. They may appear ridiculous to you, but to them they were vital. A burned hand, a sworn oath, a bawdy poem, all threads in the web of Viking honour. The longhouse creaks, the fire sputters, and you feel the claustrophobic truth settle in. There is no such thing as privacy, and there is no escaping judgment. Every ritual, every oath, every ordeal ties you tighter into a world where sex is not personal but political, not hidden but spectacular. And as the echoes of laughter die down, another story waits in the corner of the hall, one carved into myth itself. For the Norse gods were not bystanders in these rituals. Their own sagas were filled with sexual taboos, scandals, and punishments that shaped how mortals behaved. What was whispered in the hall was first thundered in the myths, and the gods were no less strange than the people who worshipped them. The longhouse falls quiet for a moment as someone begins to recite a saga, the firelight flickering across faces eager for entertainment. These tales are not bedtime stories for children. They are the mythology of an entire people, shaping the way the Vikings understood intimacy, shame, and honour. And when you listen closely, you realise that the gods themselves were embroiled in scandals stranger than anything their human worshippers could invent. Take Loki, for example, the trickster god who defied every boundary. One of the most famous myths describes him transforming into a mare to distract a giant stallion. The result was that Loki became pregnant and later gave birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, who eventually became Odin's steed. To you, it sounds absurd, the stuff of parody, but to the Vikings it was a serious tale of cunning and consequence. If their gods could swap forms, genders and roles in such dramatic ways, it is no surprise that accusations of effeminacy or passivity carried such weight among mortals. The myth provided a divine precedent, and humans lived in its shadow. The sagas are full of similar episodes. Odin himself was accused of practicing Seder, the form of magic often associated with women. Though revered as the All-Father, he was mocked for dabbling in sorcery that carried feminine connotations. This tension between power and shame filtered into human life. A man might secretly consult a sorceress for fertility magic, but if he tried to perform it himself, his honour could be shattered. The gods had already demonstrated the dangers. Odin's greatness could not erase the stain of effeminacy, and mortals had even less leeway. The god Freyr embodied fertility so fully that medieval Christian chroniclers could not resist describing his cult with a mixture of shock and disdain. According to sources like Adam of Bremen, worshippers paraded a statue of Freyr with exaggerated anatomy through fields to bless the crops. Whether or not the chroniclers exaggerated, the symbolism was unmistakable. Fertility was divine, and sexual imagery was inseparable from survival. Imagine the awkwardness of watching your neighbours march behind a wooden idol while chanting for the earth to be fruitful. What feels like comedy to you was sacred ritual to them. Even the myths of marriage and desire carried unsettling undertones. The story of Skadi, the giantess who married the sea god Njord, illustrates how mismatched unions were explained through myth. She chose him by selecting feet she thought belonged to Balder, a handsome god, only to be stuck with the wrong partner. The tale is funny, but it reveals how the Vikings framed marriage as practical, even when love was absent. For mortals, marriage was about alliances, not passion. The gods themselves made mistakes, and humans followed their example. The Eddas are filled with poems that mock the gods for sexual transgressions. Loki, in the poem Lokasenna, accuses nearly every deity of shameful behaviour. He mocks Freyr for promiscuity, Odin for practicing Seder, and others for various humiliations. The recitation of these insults shows just how central sexuality was to concepts of honour and disgrace. If the gods could be mocked endlessly for their intimate lives, mortals had little hope of escaping the same treatment. You realise that Viking law and custom were not just practical. They were modelled on a divine soap opera where shame and scandal shaped cosmic order. The humour in all this is that these were the gods people trusted to protect them, bless their crops, and lead them into battle. Deities who cross-dressed, swapped genders, and bore unusual offspring were also invoked during solemn rituals. To your modern mind, it feels contradictory. To the Vikings, it was proof that sexuality and power were inseparable. The bizarre scandals of the gods justified the bizarre rituals of the people. You picture the longhouse as the saga ends. The air is heavy with smoke, the benches creak under shifting bodies, and the listeners laugh at Loki's antics even as they nod solemnly at Odin's wisdom. Myth and reality blur, and you understand why fertility idols, legal insults and communal rituals all felt natural to them. Their gods had already demonstrated that intimacy was never private, never safe from scandal, and always tied to honour. And as the laughter fades and the embers crackle low, you realise that the myths have one more lesson to teach. If even the gods themselves could be mocked, mortals had no chance of avoiding humiliation. And that humiliation often left marks not only on reputation, but on the very artefacts buried in graves, etched into stones and scattered across archaeological digs. The stories of the gods fade into the smoky air, but the traces they left behind are not confined to sagas. They're carved into wood, cast in metal, and buried in graves that archaeologists still uncover centuries later. And when you look closely at these artifacts, you realise that Viking sexuality was not just a matter of whispers and rituals. It was inscribed into objects meant to endure, tiny echoes of embarrassment and obsession preserved for 1,000 years. One of the most striking discoveries is the abundance of amulets shaped like male anatomy. These were not subtle charms tucked discreetly out of sight. They were worn on belts, hung from doorways, or carried in pockets as tokens of fertility and protection. In some cases, they were even buried with the dead, ensuring that fertility followed into the afterlife. Archaeologists have found them carved from amber, wood, and bone, proof that superstition shaped even the smallest details of daily life. Imagine a world where your lucky charm was not a rabbit's foot, but something far less subtle swinging from your tunic as you went about your chores. Graves add more to the picture. Excavations in Scandinavia have revealed burials where fertility objects were placed alongside weapons, jewellery, and household goods. To the Viking mind, sexuality was not a private trait but part of identity itself, carried into death like a badge of honour. Some graves contain small figurines thought to represent fertility gods, miniature idols that suggest the deceased wanted divine favour even in the next world. You picture a mound opened centuries later, the soil heavy with the smell of damp earth, and inside a warrior's sword lies beside a charm shaped like something you would not expect to see in a solemn burial. The absurdity is not lost on you. This was a people who mixed battle and fertility so thoroughly that the line between sword and symbol almost blurred. Runestones tell another story. Though most were erected to commemorate the dead or declare land rights, a handful contain inscriptions that hint at sexual boasts or insults. Scholars debate the exact meanings, but some phrases carved in stone suggest that even grave markers could double as graffiti about intimacy. The permanence is striking. Modern insults vanish into the air. Viking insults were carved to last for centuries, immortalised in granite. You cannot help but laugh at the thought of archaeologists carefully brushing dirt away from a runestone, only to realise it records a joke about someone's private life. Then there are the figurines. Small metal and stone carvings, some identified as representations of gods like Freya, show exaggerated anatomy that leaves little room for interpretation. These were not abstract symbols. They were literal, detailed, and intended to project fertility as power. Imagine a world where your household shrine was not decorated with flowers or candles, but with a statue so explicit it would make a modern visitor choke on their coffee. For the Vikings, it was normal. The divine and the obscene were inseparable. Even everyday objects carry traces of this obsession. Some spindle whorls used in textile production are decorated with imagery that scholars believe carried fertility symbolism. Household items, tools, and even weapons were sometimes engraved with runes invoking luck in love or fertility. It reveals a society where no line was drawn between the practical and the intimate. You could spin wool or sharpen an axe while staring at symbols that reminded you of fertility. To the Viking mind, it was all part of keeping life moving forward. The archaeological record also sheds light on rituals we know only faintly from written sources. Animal bones arranged in fertility contexts, traces of feasting near sacred sites, and deposits of objects believed to be offerings all suggest that sex and survival were tied together in ritual practice. Imagine stumbling across a field where the soil has preserved the remnants of a Viking fertility feast. Fragments of drinking horns and animal remains still clustered together. Silent evidence of a night when chants rose into the cold air, and neighbours prayed for crops and children. The humour lies in how blunt the evidence is. Unlike modern cultures that prefer euphemism, the Vikings left behind objects so explicit they remove all doubt. A charm is a charm, a figurine is a figurine, and a runestone is not whispering but shouting across centuries. These were not a shy people, they were loud, literal, and determined to leave no ambiguity about what mattered most. You sit in the longhouse and imagine the artifacts scattered around you. A charm dangles from a neighbour's belt, a figurine rests in the corner shrine, runes are carved into the beam above the fire. The smell of smoke and sweat presses close, and you realise that the very air is thick with symbolism. Nothing is private, not even the objects meant to keep bad luck away. They are declarations, open for all to see, reminders that fertility and honour are stitched into every fibre of this culture. And the more you look, the stranger it becomes. To you, these artifacts are museum curiosities, carefully labelled and displayed under glass. To them, they were as ordinary as a cooking pot or a cloak. The gap between your world and theirs yawns wide. What makes you laugh made them solemn. What makes you uncomfortable made them confident. Archaeology does not lie. These objects are silent but clear. Viking sexuality was not hidden in shadows. It was carved, carried, and buried to endure. The longhouse grows hotter, the fire spits, and you hear the murmur of voices still trading gossip and songs. You think you've seen the worst of it, the carved charms and bawdy runestones, but the sagas remind you that objects were only part of the story. Words themselves were weapons, and Viking poetry turned reputation into art. The next tale waiting in the hall is not carved in stone or buried in earth. It is recited aloud, a weapon of humiliation sharper than any sword. The smoke in the longhouse still clings to your throat, but now it mixes with another sound. Not the clink of mead horns, not the bleating of goats, but the measured rhythm of a poem. In Viking society, words were never harmless. They carried weight, authority, and danger. And when it came to sexuality, poetry was one of the sharpest weapons anyone could wield. The tradition of nid, or ritualized insult, made mockery into performance art. To compose a verse accusing someone of cowardice, effeminacy, or promiscuity was not just an act of humour. It was an attack on their honour that could start feuds lasting generations. These insults often targeted the bedroom, because nothing struck deeper than questioning a person's role in intimacy. Imagine standing in a crowded hall while a rival recited carefully crafted lines that accused you of being passive or mocked your partner's fidelity. The audience laughed, the torches flickered, and your reputation unravelled word by word. The sagas preserve examples of this venom. In Lokasenna, the infamous flyting poem, Loki mocks the gods themselves, accusing Freya of sleeping with her brother and Odin of practicing sorcery like a woman. The audience in the poem is divine, but the cultural message was human. Accuse your rival of sexual shame and you weaken him more effectively than with a sword. In some cases, the insult was considered so serious it could be grounds for legal compensation under Icelandic law. Poetry had the same destructive potential as theft or violence. Archaeological traces show that poetry was not just oral, but inscribed. Runestones carry cryptic phrases that some scholars interpret as boasts or jibes. One stone in Sweden bears an inscription that scholars have argued may allude to sexual slander. The idea that someone would carve such an accusation into stone is both absurd and telling. Words were permanent, and reputations lived or died by them. The humour lies in the sheer creativity of it. A warrior society that glorified blood and steel spent equal energy crafting elaborate rhymes to suggest someone had been unmanly in bed. It is as if professional insult comedy was treated with the seriousness of law. You picture poets in smoky halls, their voices rising over the din of laughter, the smell of ale heavy in the air, as reputations cracked under the weight of rhyme. What made this even more dangerous was the public nature of the insult. It was not whispered behind doors. It was performed before audiences who would carry the words home, repeat them, and let them spread. Once spoken, they could not be recalled. A man might survive wounds in battle, but he could not survive being branded Arga in verse. Even worse, his children and grandchildren might inherit the shame, because sagas remembered far longer than living memory. Women were not spared. Slander against them often focused on infidelity or promiscuity. accusations that could strip a family of honour or unsettle alliances. A poem that painted a woman as unfaithful could ripple outward, undermining marriages, property rights and political arrangements. Imagine a single verse undoing the fabric of your social life with the same efficiency as an axe-cutting rope. And yet, for all their cruelty, these poems were admired for their artistry. Skalds, the poets of the Viking Age, were celebrated for their cleverness. A devastating insult could elevate the poet's reputation even as it destroyed the targets. This is why gatherings often turned into contests of verse, where praise and mockery mingled. You can almost hear the hall roaring with laughter, the firelight flickering across faces flushed with drink, as lines sharper than steel fly through the air. The effect was total. Intimacy was not only public through shared longhouses and rituals, it was weaponized in verse, carved into memory and sung into eternity. To live in Viking society was to live under constant risk of poetic humiliation. Your private life was never private. It was material waiting to be turned into rhyme. The sensory weight of this realization settles over you. The hall smells of sweat and smoke. The air buzzes with laughter, and you feel the sting of words you have not even heard yet. It is claustrophobic, not because of the furs or the goats, but because of the knowledge that your reputation is fragile, balanced on the tongues of poets eager for an easy rhyme. This weaponization of words was not unique to Scandinavia, but the Vikings perfected it. They left behind sagas thick with insults, legal codes that treated slander as crime, and runestones that hint at graffiti carved in stone. The legacy is clear. For the Vikings, sex was not only ritual, duty, or magic. It was material for art, comedy, and humiliation. And as the last verse dies away, you realise that poetry was only one form of performance. Ritual itself was theatre too, often staged with props, feasts, and gestures that blurred the line between celebration and obscenity. What poetry did with words, ritual did with bodies. And the next chapter waiting in the smoky longhouse is stranger still, because it was performed not by poets, but by entire communities under the eyes of their gods. The hall still hums with the echoes of verse, but the laughter gives way to chanting. Fertility festivals were not just stories or poems, they were lived rituals, staged in fields, sacred groves, and even the smoky longhouses themselves. For the Vikings, survival depended on fertility in every sense: the soil, the herds, and the human body. And to make sure none of these failed, entire communities gathered to perform rites that to you would look like a mix of religious procession and questionable theatre. The most famous of these festivals were tied to seasonal cycles. At Yule, celebrating midwinter, fertility was a theme alongside feasting and sacrifice. The sagas describe the blots, sacrificial rituals where animals were slaughtered and their blood sprinkled on altars, walls, and participants. To the Norse mind, blood carried life force, and spraying it across the hall was a way of feeding the gods and blessing the people. The smell of iron-rich blood mingling with smoke and mead must have been overwhelming, a thick fog of sacred intensity. To your modern perspective, it looks less like a blessing, and more like a horror scene, but to them it was hope incarnate. Freyr, the god of fertility, was central to many of these celebrations. Sources like Adam of Bremen, though written through Christian eyes, describe cult statues of Freyr carried in processions, sometimes in explicitly carved forms. The idol was paraded through fields to encourage the soil to bear fruit, the same way a couple was expected to bear heirs. It is difficult not to imagine the awkward laughter of farmers trailing behind a wooden phallus on a cart while chanting for grain, but for them it was deadly serious. Crops meant survival, and survival meant ritual. Feasting accompanied these rites, and with feasting came intoxication. Mead and ale loosened tongues and blurred inhibitions, turning sacred ritual into something rowdier. Archaeological digs at sites like Gamla Uppsala in Sweden suggest large feasts tied to seasonal sacrifices, complete with vast quantities of animal remains. Picture the scene: fires roaring in the dark, meat sizzling on spits, horns of mead sloshing as chants rise into the cold night. Fertility blessings flowed as freely as the alcohol, and what began as ritual often ended as chaotic celebration. The line between sacred and profane was thin, and everyone knew it. Scholars have long debated just how explicit these festivals became. Some later Christian chroniclers accused pagans of indulging in sexual orgies during fertility rites. While such accusations were likely exaggerated to paint heathens as immoral, there are hints in the sources that some rituals did involve symbolic or performative acts tied to intimacy. The imagery of Freya's cult, the fertility songs, and the communal feasting all suggest that sexuality was not hidden, but folded openly into religious life. Even if the reality was more symbolic than literal, the perception alone shaped how outsiders described them. The absurdity is clear. Imagine your entire community gathering in the dead of winter, blood spraying, meat roasting, idols paraded, while neighbours chant for fertility. You stand there, your boots sinking into mud, the air stinking of smoke and blood, and you realise that this is religion and entertainment rolled into one. Privacy has no role here. Your survival depends on joining the chorus, no matter how awkward the symbolism becomes. Spring rituals carried the same theme. Farmers might bless fields with symbolic ploughing, sometimes involving naked participants riding or straddling ploughs to mimic the fertility of the earth. What seems like a bizarre prank to you was, to them, a way of coaxing crops from frozen soil. The sensory overload of shouting, laughter, and the creak of wooden ploughs must have echoed across fields, blending with the cries of ravens overhead. Even weddings blurred into public fertility ritual. After feasts, the couple were led to bed in front of witnesses, sometimes with fertility songs sung at their expense. The community invested itself in the couple's future children, because children meant stronger alliances and more hands for farming and war. The embarrassment you feel imagining the scene would have been irrelevant to them. Privacy was never the goal. Continuity was. Archaeological evidence reinforces the scale of these gatherings. Animal bones at ritual sites show mass slaughter, not just for sustenance but for sacrifice. Drinking horns found in graves suggest feasting was central to identity itself. Ritual deposits of food, tools, and idols remind us that fertility was a constant preoccupation. The sheer effort poured into these festivals, from animal herds to crafted idols, reveals how much weight the Vikings gave to ritualize sexuality as the foundation of life. What lingers most is the sensory experience. The cold air biting your face, the warmth of the fire roaring at your back, the stench of blood and sweat filling your nostrils, and the sound of chanting vibrating in your bones. You're part of something overwhelming, both sacred and ridiculous, and you realize that this was how Vikings made sense of their precarious survival. Fertility was not private. It was public, noisy, and dripping with symbolism you could not escape. And just as the chanting dies down and the fires smoulder low, you realize that the festivals were only one stage. The rituals did not stop at communal feasts. They carried into marriages, into households, into the very bedding of newlyweds. And in those ceremonies, the community often played a role so intrusive, it makes the fertility processions look tame. The fires of the fertility feast still smoulder, but the next stage of ritual is even more invasive. Weddings in the Viking Age were never just about two people. They were legal contracts, economic arrangements, and social spectacles, and the consummation of marriage was everyone's business. When you imagine marriage as a private celebration with flowers, music, and a honeymoon getaway, erase it. The Vikings had their own version, and it was equal parts theatre, humiliation, and duty. A Viking wedding began as a negotiation. Families arranged marriages to secure alliances, property, or status. The ceremony itself often took place at a feast, where oaths were sworn, gifts exchanged, and drinking horns passed around until the hall shook with laughter and song. The bride was expected to carry a sword from her family to her husband, symbolizing the transfer of ancestral honor. the sword was heavy, its blade gleaming in the torchlight, a reminder that this union was not just romantic but political. The entire community watched, the air thick with smoke, mead and anticipation. But the true focus of the night came later when the couple were led to bed. Unlike modern notions of privacy, this was often a communal ritual. Guests might escort the pair with songs, laughter and bawdy jokes, making clear that the union was not a secret but a public guarantee of future children. Some accounts suggest witnesses were present to confirm the marriage had been consummated. Imagine lying under scratchy wool blankets, the floor creaking beneath you, while drunken relatives chuckle outside the door. Privacy was not the goal. Proof was. The sagas hint at how intense this could be. In Laxdela Saga, wedding nights are described with attention to whether the union produced heirs, and gossip spread quickly if a couple failed. Intimacy was tied to honour, and failure to produce children reflected poorly on both families. The weight of expectation was crushing. A marriage was not considered secure until children arrived, and the first night was the symbolic opening act in a long play. Even the bedding was ritualised. In some traditions, the bed itself was blessed, often with symbols of fertility placed nearby. Carved idols, charms, or even sacrificed animals might be invoked to ensure success. Archaeological finds of fertility figurines in domestic contexts suggest that these objects were not confined to festivals, but part of household ritual. Imagine climbing into bed only to find your mattress blessed with a carved wooden idol staring at you, silently demanding results. The humour, if you can call it that, comes from the sheer lack of subtlety. Entire communities invested themselves in the bedroom lives of couples because survival depended on it. If you could not produce heirs, alliances crumbled, property lines blurred, and reputations collapsed. Your personal life was public property, and every creak of the longhouse floor carried meaning. Weddings themselves often included fertility songs, ribald verses sung loudly as the couple were ushered to bed. These were not quiet lullabies, but raucous chants filled with innuendo. The laughter, the stomping of feet, the smell of spilled mead all combined into an atmosphere where the first night of marriage felt more like a sporting event than a private union. Privacy did not exist. Performance did. Christian chroniclers writing about Norse pagans often exaggerated or condemned these rituals, but even their hostile accounts confirm the centrality of fertility. They described weddings as scandalous affairs where bawdy humour, feasting, and public rituals overshadowed subtlety. While these writers may have painted a darker picture than reality, the archaeological and saga evidence shows that they were not inventing the public nature of Viking marriages. The sensory reality presses in on you. The hall reeks of sweat, ash, and roasted meat. The guests are still singing, their voices slurred with drink, their laughter echoing. You're aware that every move you make will be remembered and repeated tomorrow at the well, in the fields, and in future sagas. Your body is no longer your own. It is the vessel of alliance, inheritance, and continuity. The absurdity of it all is staggering. What should have been private became theatre. What should have been personal became communal property. The couple might have tried to steal a moment of intimacy in the chaos, but even then the knowledge of witnesses lurking nearby crushed any illusion of romance. It was not about passion. It was about fertility, lineage, and public expectation. And when the night ended, the gossip began. Success was celebrated, failure mocked. Verse might be composed, stories told, reputations adjusted. Marriage was not a quiet union, but an entry into a world of public judgment. You could fight a battle and earn glory, but stumble in your wedding bed and the shame could outlast your victories. The laughter in the hall fades to a low hum. The fire spits, and you realise that intimacy in Viking society was never free from judgment. Whether in fertility festivals or wedding beds, the community was always there, watching, commenting and recording. And yet there was another arena where intimacy was entangled with honour. one that carried consequences as dangerous as battle itself. For in Viking culture, sexuality and warfare were not separate. They mirrored each other, bound by the same code of honour, insult and survival. The wedding feast has ended, the laughter fading into whispers, but the expectations that haunted the marriage bed followed men onto the battlefield. In Viking society, intimacy and warfare were never entirely separate. Both were measured by honour, both judged by peers, and both could destroy reputations if a man was thought to have failed in his role. To you, it sounds absurd to connect axes and oaths with blankets and bedding, but to the Norse mind, they were two sides of the same coin. The insult arga, the dreaded accusation of unmanliness, could mean cowardice in battle or passivity in intimacy. To be branded as such was a stain no duel could easily erase. Warriors were expected to dominate in both arenas, to be aggressive, bold, and victorious. A stumble in either sphere reflected weakness in the other. It was not just about survival, it was about image, about the story others would tell of you long after your body was ash in a grave mound. The sagas are filled with moments where sexual insult is paired with martial disgrace. In a Guild saga, versus mock enemies not only for cowardice but for alleged bedroom shame. The logic was cruelly consistent. If you could not master your household, how could you master a battlefield? Words cut deep, turning warriors into objects of ridicule long after the clash of steel had ended. Archaeological finds of warrior burials reinforce this overlap. Graves that contained weapons also sometimes contained charms tied to fertility. A sword lay beside a hammer-shaped amulet of Thor, symbol of strength, but also protection of households and fertility. To the Viking imagination, the man who wielded a blade was also the man expected to wield authority and intimacy. The line between the battlefield and the bed was blurred in symbolic terms. The humour, of course, comes in how literal this became. A warrior could sail halfway across the sea, hack his way through defenders, and seize treasure, only to return home and find his reputation undone by a whispered joke about his love life. You can imagine the frustration, the longhouse buzzing with gossip while a warrior who faced down spears sat helpless against the sharper weapon of rumour. The battlefield was dangerous, but the bedroom was lethal in ways steel never was. Norse poetry often paired these themes. Skaldic verse mocked enemies as both unmanly in combat and in intimacy, weaving the two together as if they were inseparable. The insult was effective because it appealed to the cultural obsession with dominance. The man who failed in one role was assumed to fail in the other. The absurdity lies in how seriously this was taken. Wars were fought, alliances collapsed, and feuds burned over accusations as much about bedding as about bravery. Even gods reflected this link. Odin, mocked for practicing sorcery, was accused of effeminacy, a charge that weakened not only his role as a deity of magic, but also his martial image. Loki's constant accusations in the myths often paired insults about war with insults about sex. The myths justified the human obsession, reinforcing the idea that the two worlds mirrored one another. The sensory reality of this connection is crushing. The longhouse smells of iron and sweat, the same odours that cling to a battlefield. The laughter of poets echoes in the rafters, reminding you that even your victories abroad mean little if you stumble at home. Every movement, every choice, every whisper becomes evidence in a trial that never ends. You're always judged, whether by steel or by straw. And then there is the strange ritual of boasting. Warriors returning from raids were expected to share their deeds in feasts, recounting victories to the roar of drunken comrades. These boasts often slipped from martial exploits into personal ones, the line between battlefield conquest and bedroom conquest erased in the telling. Bragging about both was part of proving honour. To you, it sounds like awkward table talk. To them, it was tradition. Christian chroniclers, horrified by this culture, recorded their disdain with heavy judgment. They accused Vikings of immorality, of confusing sacred duties with base pleasures. While these writers exaggerated, their shock at the overlap reveals how different Norse values were. Where others drew sharp boundaries, the Vikings embraced fluidity, treating sex and war as stages for the same performance of honour. What lingers is the absurd imbalance. A man could bleed on foreign soil and still be undone by a rhyme muttered in a hall. His sword might gleam, but if his role in intimacy was questioned, his reputation rotted. You realise that Viking culture was built on fragility, a web of honour so tightly spun that one broken thread could collapse the whole design. The hall grows smoky again, the fire crackling low. Around you, men boast of raids, women exchange knowing glances, poets sharpen their tongues for another verse. The weight of reputation presses down like the smell of damp wool, suffocating and inescapable. Sex and war, private and public, body and blade, all blurred together until there was no separating them. And yet there was another layer still. If honour shaped men through both battle and bedding, the rituals of women carried equal weight, though in very different ways. The burdens placed on them were steeped in fertility, fidelity, and the ever-watchful eyes of the community. Their roles were no less bound by ritual, and their scandals could topple families as easily as a failed raid. The fire in the longhouse burns lower, but the weight of expectation never fades. If Viking men lived under the crushing burden of honour, Viking women carried their own set of impossible obligations. Their lives were bound by fertility, fidelity, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbours who treated private matters as public business. To survive as a woman in this world was to endure rituals and customs so invasive that the line between duty and humiliation blurred beyond recognition. Fertility was not optional. A wife's worth was measured by her ability to produce children, especially sons. Archaeological evidence from burials shows that women of high status were sometimes interred with small fertility idols, weaving tools and charms linked to reproduction. These objects were not mere decorations. They were symbols of her role in society. A man might be buried with a sword, but a woman might be buried with objects that reminded everyone her legacy was tied to the cradle. Magic amplified this burden. Women were expected to practice certain forms of household sorcery to ensure fertility and protect the family. Seder, the ritual magic associated with prophecy and fate, was often performed by women. This placed them in a paradoxical position. They were feared for their connection to unseen forces, yet mocked or condemned if those powers were seen as excessive. To chant blessings over a womb or field was expected. To be too skilled at it risked being accused of wielding dangerous sorcery. The irony is rich. A woman's power was both essential and suspect, praised and condemned in equal measure. Fidelity carried even sharper edges. The sagas describe countless disputes where women were accused of infidelity, and the consequences were brutal. A man could sue for divorce, demand compensation, or even take violent revenge if he believed his wife unfaithful. Women, too, could divorce husbands for mistreatment or impotence, but the cultural focus fell heavily on female fidelity. Imagine living in a world where gossip about your private life could spill into legal hearings as quickly as a boundary dispute over sheep. Public tests of fidelity sometimes took theatrical forms. In some accounts, women accused of adultery were forced to swear oaths before witnesses or undergo ritual questioning. The humiliation of standing in a crowded hall, smoke stinging your eyes, as neighbours and relatives debated your faithfulness is almost unbearable to imagine. Privacy was stripped away, replaced with ritualised shame that left scars on reputation even if innocence was proven. The sagas reveal how cruelly these rituals played out. In the Jarl saga, women are mocked in verse for alleged infidelities, and these insults spark feuds that ripple outward into bloodshed. The poems sting because they touch on what society valued most: fertility and loyalty. A verse could undo a woman's standing faster than years of careful behaviour could repair it. The hall would erupt in laughter, the smell of mead and sweat filling the air while the accused sat powerless, her life reduced to a punchline. Even weddings, which were supposed to celebrate unions, placed women under scrutiny. A bride carried a sword to her husband as part of the ceremony, symbolising the transfer of her family's honour. The weight of the blade in her hands was matched by the weight of expectation in her womb. Guests cheered, laughed, and sang bawdy songs, but beneath the noise was a silent demand. Produce heirs, prove your loyalty, secure the future. Failure was not just personal, it was communal. The archaeological record underscores this pressure. Excavations at burial sites in Scandinavia reveal spindle whorls, distaffs, and weaving tools placed alongside female skeletons. These were not simply reminders of domestic work, they were fertility symbols, tying women eternally to the rituals of creation. Some graves also contained amulets shaped like phallic charms, suggesting that women too carried or were buried with fertility objects. Imagine lying for eternity with a carved charm resting beside you, your identity in death as defined by fertility as it was in life. The absurdity comes from how little room for error existed. A man might redeem himself in battle. A woman had fewer paths. Her honour rested on her body's ability to conceive, carry, and remain faithful, all while being subject to scrutiny from neighbours, poets, and gods. The hall smelled of damp wool and smoke. The benches creaked with laughter, and through it all women endured expectations that left no space for privacy or individuality. The gods themselves reinforced this obsession. Freya, goddess of love and fertility, was both worshipped and mocked in myths. Loki's insults in Lokasenna accuse her of promiscuity, yet her power was undeniable. She was invoked in rituals, honoured in sacrifices, and carried in the imaginations of those who needed her blessing. Mortal women lived under the shadow of this contradiction. They were celebrated as life-bringers, yet shamed for any suggestion of freedom. You sit in the longhouse and feel the tension. The fire crackles, voices murmur, and the weight of judgment is thick in the smoke. Every woman here carries the burden of ritual and expectation. Every movement is scrutinized, every whisper magnified, every act folded into the communal record. It is not enough to live. One must live within the lines society has drawn, and those lines are etched in smoke, stone, and saga. And yet even this does not capture the full picture. For beyond free women bound by family and fertility were the enslaved, whose bodies were subject to rituals and abuses far darker still. Their role in Viking sexuality was not defined by honour or expectation, but by power and ownership, a stark reminder that beneath the rituals of fertility and fidelity lay an undercurrent of exploitation. The longhouse grows quieter, but the silence is heavy. You cannot escape the knowledge that not everyone inside is here by choice. For the Vikings, slavery was a fact of life, and enslaved men and women were not only labourers, but also entangled in the rituals of sexuality. Their presence reveals the darker side of Viking intimacy, where fertility, power, and exploitation intertwined. Slavery in the Viking Age was widespread. Raids across the British Isles, Ireland, and Eastern Europe filled longhouses with thralls, people taken in war or captured in raids. Archaeological evidence from towns like Dublin, once a Viking hub of the slave trade, confirms the scale. Slave markets buzzed with transactions, the air thick with the stench of animals, fish, and human bodies awaiting sale. These thralls were forced into households, their lives defined by service. And service in this context often included sexual access. The sagas do not shy away from this reality. In Laxdela saga, concubines and thralls appear as part of the household structure, their presence woven into daily life. Legal codes even accounted for children born to enslaved women, treating their status differently depending on whether the father acknowledged them. It was ritualized hierarchy, intimacy reduced to property law. You can almost hear the scratch of a scribe's quill, recording the fate of a child not as a person, but as an asset. For enslaved women, fertility became a commodity. A child born from a union with a free man could complicate inheritance or strengthen it, depending on whether the father chose recognition. Law codes from Iceland and Norway reveal a bureaucratic obsession with these matters, spelling out compensation, ownership, and legitimacy in painstaking detail. Imagine your body treated as a ledger entry, your womb a contested space of power and property. Even rituals reflected this hierarchy. Enslaved women could be offered as concubines during marriage negotiations, or kept as symbols of wealth. Their presence was not hidden, it was paraded. The longhouse might smell of roasting meat and burning pine, but in the corner a thrall spun wool, a silent reminder of power and possession. Guests knew her role extended beyond labour. The absurdity lies in how normalised it was. To the Vikings, sexual access to thralls was not scandalous but expected. Christian chroniclers, horrified by these practices, condemned them as proof of pagan immorality. Yet even those hostile accounts confirm the cultural truth. Ownership included the body, and rituals of intimacy folded that reality into household structure. The irony is that while honour obsessed free men and women, thralls lived outside those codes, their experiences erased from the reputational games of insult and poetry. They were both invisible and indispensable. Archaeology deepens the picture. Some burial sites show thralls sacrificed and buried alongside masters. There remains evidence of ritual killings tied to funerary rites. Scholars suggest these deaths symbolise loyalty and service extending into the afterlife. If this included sexual service in life, the logic carried into death. A grotesque continuity. The smell of damp earth, the weight of silence, and the knowledge that even the grave could not free them from ritual. The sagas occasionally reveal moments of tension. Children born to thralls might rise to prominence if acknowledged, blurring the rigid boundaries of status. But these stories often carried stigma, with rivals mocking lineage as tainted. Again, sexuality became weaponized, not only against free men and women, but against those whose origins were marked by slavery. You can picture the sneer of a rival in a smoky hall, dismissing another's honour with a reminder of their mother's status. Words sharper than blades. Humour creeps in through the contradictions. A society obsessed with fertility, lineage, and reputation depended heavily on the bodies of those it enslaved, yet tried to erase their voices from the record. It is like building a saga on silence, pretending the foundation does not exist while standing squarely on it. The absurdity stings because it is real. The sensory atmosphere of it all presses in. The hall reeks of sweat, smoke and mead. Thralls move quietly through the shadows, carrying horns, fetching wood, spinning wool. Their presence is constant yet ignored, a backdrop to the rituals of honour and fertility. The community chants for Freya, parades idols through the fields, mocks rivals with verses, all while enslaved bodies sustain the household in silence. This silence is the most telling ritual of all. The rituals of fertility, fidelity and poetry belong to the free. Thralls had no role in honour, but their exploitation shaped the culture anyway. Sexuality in the Viking Age was not only about charms, insults and festivals. It was also about power, ownership and hierarchy. The community may not have sung about it, but the reality was carved into law codes, sagas and graves. And as the fire in the hall burns lower, you feel the weight of it settle in. The rituals of honour and humiliation seem almost absurd until you remember the darker rituals of power beneath them. Viking intimacy was not just bizarre, it was brutal. And yet even here the story does not end, because the laws themselves spelled out punishments for misconduct in ways so strange that they blur the line between courtroom and comedy. The hall grows quiet as disputes rise to the surface. Not every scandal ended in whispered verse or mocking poetry. Some drag themselves into the thing, the Viking legal assembly, where judges weighed matters of property, blood feuds, and yes, even accusations of sexual shame. You would expect law to bring order, but in the Viking Age it often looked like theatre, with punishments that blended practicality, humiliation, and a sense of cosmic irony. Iceland's Gragas, one of the best preserved medieval law codes, devotes entire sections to matters of sexual honour. To accuse a man of being aga, meaning effeminate or passive, without proof could trigger legal penalties as severe as outlawry. Outlawry was no light sentence. It meant you were cast out of society, free game for anyone who wished to kill you without consequence. Imagine modern defamation law, but instead of fines or apologies, the punishment was permanent exile with a side of probable murder. Adultery was another battlefield of law. For a man, catching his wife in the arms of another could justify violence or demand compensation. Compensation usually came in the form of silver, the currency of both trade and blood price. Law codes carefully listed the amounts owed, as if betrayal could be tidily measured in coin. The absurdity is striking. You could raid a monastery and haggle over treasure, or accuse your neighbour of infidelity and haggle over silver. Both were treated as transactions recorded in the same legal rhythm. Punishments were not always monetary. Shaming rituals carried their own weight. A guilty party might be subject to mocking verses recited publicly, which carried almost the same sting as physical punishment. These sagas describe instances where reputations crumbled more thoroughly under satire than under the blade. It was proof that Viking justice valued public humiliation as much as silver or exile. The smell of mead and smoke would hang in the air as a hall roared with laughter at someone else's expense. Justice delivered in rhyme instead of blood. Some laws bordered on the bizarre. Sexual misconduct with thralls, for instance, was not judged by the same standards as misconduct with free people. A free man's access to enslaved women was not scandalous in the same way, yet children born of such unions created endless legal tangles. Codes spelled out inheritance rights, obligations, and even compensation owed if disputes arose. You can picture the law speaker reciting long winding clauses about who owed silver for whose children, the crowd stifling yawns as intimacy turned into bureaucracy. Homosexual relations were judged harshly, particularly when accusations implied a man had taken the passive role. The insult carried such weight that it could start blood feuds, as the legal system treated sexual shame as equivalent to physical harm. The law's logic was brutal. Reputation was property, and to damage it was theft. To your modern perspective, it is shocking to see private acts legislated with such severity, but to them it was consistent with their obsession with honour. There were even laws that punished slander more than actual misconduct. A man caught in questionable circumstances might escape with minimal consequence, but someone who falsely accused him risked ruin. The paradox is almost comedic. Commit the act and face fines. Spread rumours without proof and face exile. It reveals how much weight they placed on control of narrative. What mattered was not truth, but the story society believed. Archaeological traces of law are rare, but the thing sites themselves, open-air assemblies marked by stones or mounds, set the stage. Picture hundreds gathered on a windswept plain, the smell of sea salt and grass in the air, while disputes about honour and intimacy were argued with the same seriousness as land rights. A man stood accused, neighbours muttered, judges deliberated, and reputations hung in the balance. It was courtroom drama, with an audience of farmers, warriors and poets, all eager for scandal. The humour lies in the sheer drama of it. Viking society treated intimacy like a legal chess match, complete with silver compensation, ritual shaming, and the ever-present threat of violence. Your private life was not private. It was case law waiting to be cited, gossip waiting to be carved into memory, and punishment waiting to be delivered. And as the crowd disperses, the smoke of cook fires drifting across the field, you realise that law did not tame these rituals. It only codified them, giving scandal the weight of precedent and punishment. Yet beneath the legal theatre lay another layer of ritual, one tied not to people but to animals. For fertility was not only human business. The survival of Viking society depended on livestock, and fertility rituals involving animals were just as bizarre, just as symbolic, and just as uncomfortable. The thing assembly fades into memory, but the obsession with fertility lingers. It was not just human bodies that carried this burden. Animals, the lifeblood of Viking farms, were bound to the same rituals of fertility and intimacy. Cattle, horses, pigs, and goats were more than food or labour. They were sacred symbols, sometimes sacrificed, sometimes paraded, and sometimes woven into rites that blur the line between agriculture and theatre. The horse held pride of place in these rituals. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia reveal horse burials tied to fertility and sacrifice. Horses were slaughtered at blots, their blood sprinkled on participants and altars to bless both the community and the land. Written accounts, particularly from Christian observers like Adam of Bremen, describe processions where horses were central to fertility rites. The horse, sleek and powerful, embodied virility. To you, it is an animal grazing in a field. To them, it was the symbol of prosperity itself. The air must have been thick with the smell of horse sweat and blood, the chants of the crowd rising as though the animal itself carried the future of the harvest. The horse was also bound to sexuality and myth. Freya, god of fertility, was associated with the animal, and the infamous myth of Loki giving birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, added to the connection. The symbolism is awkward at best. A society that relied on horses for ploughing, war and transport also loaded them with intimate symbolism. You cannot look at a plough horse the same way once you realise that its strength in the field was mirrored by its role in fertility rites. Goats played their part too. Thor's goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, could be slaughtered and resurrected, symbolising renewal and abundance. Goats were often sacrificed at fertility feasts, their meat consumed in communal meals meant to strengthen bonds and ensure survival. The sagas sometimes describe goats in crude metaphors, their fertility tied to the fertility of the land. Imagine the bleating of goats filling the longhouse, the smell of singed hair and roasting meat clinging to your clothes, all while participants chanted for abundance. Cattle carried their own weight in symbolism. Wealth was often measured in cows, and their ability to reproduce was directly tied to prosperity. Laws even accounted for disputes over cattle fertility, treating the breeding success of animals as legal property. Cattle were blessed at seasonal festivals, sometimes marked with blood from sacrifices or driven in processions around fields. The absurdity is in the seriousness. Imagine your neighbours chanting blessings to your cow, as though the animal itself held the key to the family's future. In their world, it did. Pigs, associated with Freya, were sacrificed at Yule feasts. The boar in particular was sacred, its meat consumed during rituals meant to secure fertility and prosperity. Archaeological finds of boar tusks and graves suggest their symbolic power extended into death. Eating boar during Yule was not just a feast, it was a ritual act binding the community to the gods of fertility. The smell of pork fat sizzling over fire, the crunch of tusks as trophies, all part of a sensory world where eating was inseparable from ritual. These animal rituals were not hidden. They were public performances, spectacles of slaughter, feasting, and symbolism. The blood, the chants, the feasts all blurred the line between religion and intimacy. Fertility was not confined to the bedroom. It extended into the barnyard. A cow's ability to calve, a goat's fertility, a horse's virility were as crucial as a woman's womb. The survival of the community rested on this tangled web of reproduction, both human and animal. Archaeology reveals the scale. At sites like Gamla Uppsala, mass deposits of animal bones testify to ritual slaughter on a grand scale. Layers of soil reveal repeated sacrifices year after year, as though the community could not survive without reenacting the ritual. The ground itself smelled of blood, soaked with centuries of fertility rites. You can almost hear the echo of chants across the field, the clatter of bones, the hiss of fat dripping into fire. The humour creeps in when you step back. This was a society that treated livestock like sacred fertility mascots. Horses paraded, goats sacrificed, pigs feasted, cows blessed. It sounds like the world's strangest petting zoo crossed with a fertility clinic. Yet for the Vikings, it was not absurd. It was survival. Every chant, every sacrifice, every feast was a desperate plea to the gods. The longhouse fills again with noise as feasting begins. The smell of roasting goat and pork mingles with mead. The torches sputter and laughter rises. But beneath the laughter is the hum of ritual, the understanding that animals and humans alike are bound in the same cycle. Fertility is not a private matter. It is a communal obsession, stitched into every corner of Viking life. And as you taste the smoky meat and hear the chants roll on, you realize that the obsession with fertility did not end with life. It followed people into death, buried with them in mounds, carved into stones, and etched into the afterlife itself. The next rituals waiting to unfold are not for the living, but for those already gone, where fertility and sexuality clung even to the grave. The fires die down in the feast hall, but the rituals do not end with the living. For the Vikings, fertility was carried into death, woven into burial rites that treated sexuality as a force too powerful to be left behind. The grave was not just a resting place. It was a stage where symbols of reproduction, potency, and fertility followed the body into eternity. Archaeologists peeling back layers of soil have found evidence that leaves little doubt. The bizarre rituals of intimacy were as present in the mound as in the longhouse. Take the famous Oseberg ship burial. Discovered in Norway, it contained 2 women laid to rest with an astonishing collection of goods. Among the artifacts was a carved cart decorated with imagery so intricate and, in some interpretations, so explicit that scholars debate whether it symbolized fertility rituals. The Oseberg burial is often called the most spectacular Viking grave ever found. But behind the wealth and woodwork is the whisper of ritual sexuality. It was not enough to send the dead with treasures. They needed symbols of fertility too, as though the afterlife required heirs as urgently as the world of the living. Other graves reveal the same logic. Men buried with weapons were sometimes accompanied by charms shaped like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. On the surface, the hammer was a symbol of protection, but it also carried fertility associations. To lay it beside a body was to arm the deceased with potency in more than one sense. Archaeologists in Sweden have uncovered small hammer-shaped amulets in both male and female graves, tiny pieces of metal that spoke louder than words. Imagine your tombstone decorated not with solemn scripture, but with symbols suggesting the gods should guarantee your virility in the afterlife. Animal remains deepen the picture. Horses and boars, both tied to fertility deities, were frequently buried alongside their owners. The soil is thick with the bones of animals slaughtered for funerary rites, their presence ensuring abundance for the departed. The boar especially carried sexual symbolism. Its tusks have been found placed carefully in graves, like trophies of fertility and power. The smell of earth and decay mingled with the ghost of roasting meat from the funeral feast. The entire ritual a sensory performance binding sex, death, and survival into one. The sagas echo this connection. Funeral descriptions often include boasts about the number of children the deceased left behind, as though fertility itself was a legacy to be remembered alongside raiding and wealth. A man's sword, a woman's weaving tools, a couple's children all became parts of the same story. Sexuality was not hidden in these accounts. It was celebrated as proof of a life lived in alignment with cultural duty. Some burials, however, reveal darker possibilities. Accounts from Arab travellers, like Ibn Fadlan, describe funeral rituals along the Volga River, where enslaved women were sacrificed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan's account, though filtered through an outsider's perspective, describes ritualized intimacy performed before sacrifice, a grotesque blending of fertility and death. Archaeologists debate the accuracy, but the possibility alone is chilling. Imagine standing in the crowd as the smoke from the funeral pyre rose into the air. the scent of burning pine mixing with screams and chanting, the ritual binding life and death in one terrible performance. The absurdity is how consistent it all is. From charms in pockets to animals in graves, from carved symbols to ritual sacrifices, fertility followed the Vikings from cradle to grave. You would think death might free them from the suffocating rituals of reproduction, but the culture insisted otherwise. Even in the afterlife, your potency, your honour, and your fertility mattered. Archaeological digs confirm the obsessive detail. Soil samples reveal layers of ash from funeral pyres mixed with animal fat, bone fragments, and sometimes traces of feasting. Drinking horns shattered deliberately, beads scattered, idols broken and buried. These were not random acts. They were ritual, each gesture loaded with symbolism. The air at these funerals must have been thick with smoke and meaning, neighbours whispering about what the objects revealed of the deceased's life and reputation. And then there is the poetry. Skaldic verse commemorating the dead often highlighted fertility, weaving children, wives and lineages into the same verses that celebrated raids and victories. To die childless was shameful, a blemish that carried into memory. The afterlife was not just about valour, it was about leaving heirs and abundance. Even Valhalla, imagined as a hall of warriors, was bound to fertility. After all, endless feasting required endless herds. The animals resurrected each day as though fertility itself was eternal. The sensory pressure builds again. The damp soil clings to your boots, the smell of blood and smoke fills your nose, the chanting echoes against the hills. Fertility, sexuality, death, and memory all fold into one overwhelming ritual. The mound rises, the grave closes, and yet the obsession remains. The Vikings refused to leave sex behind. They carried it into death, carved it into stone, and buried it in soil. And as you turn from the mound, the rituals waiting ahead are not tied to death but to life's daily rhythms. For even outside feasts, weddings and funerals, Viking intimacy was tangled in a web of taboos and prohibitions that shaped everyday behaviour. The rules of what you could and could not do, who you could and could not touch, reveal a culture as obsessed with restriction as it was with ritual. The mound closes, the soil settles, and yet Viking intimacy does not stay buried. It follows into the waking world, where daily life was as riddled with rules as the grave was with charms. Sexual taboos in Viking society were not whispered curiosities. They were carved into law, etched into insults, and wielded as weapons sharper than any sword. To understand them is to glimpse how seriously these people took the business of reputation, and how absurdly creative they became in enforcing it. The sagas reveal a world where to accuse someone of the wrong kind of intimacy could start a feud that ended in blood. The insult was called ergi. At its core, it implied sexual passivity in men, and it was one of the most serious accusations you could make. Call a Viking Aga, and you were not just questioning his private life. You were declaring him socially unfit, dishonourable, and open to violence. It was so severe that some law codes treated the insult itself as justification for legal combat. Imagine your entire social standing resting on whether or not your neighbours believed a shouted rumour about your bedroom conduct. But it did not end with men. Women too had boundaries that could not be crossed. Accusations of promiscuity, infidelity, or inappropriate conduct carried enormous weight. Honour was communal in Viking society. A single rumour could ripple through kinship networks, sour marriage alliances, and even destabilise wealth transfers. Viking intimacy was never private. It was public currency, traded in reputation, and policed with a sharp edge of language. The prohibitions stretched into ritual. Certain acts, if performed in the wrong context, were believed to pollute the sacred. Sexual activity during specific festivals was thought to invite disaster. Ritual spaces, especially those tied to sacrifices, demanded abstinence. Scholars debate the extent of these rules, but archaeology reveals a telling detail. In some sacred bog deposits, clothing and weapons are carefully arranged, but there is a conspicuous absence of fertility symbols. It suggests moments when the culture drew hard lines between the sacred and the sexual, lines that could not be crossed without risk of divine punishment. Magic only complicated things. In a society where Seder, the Norse sorcery often associated with women, blurred boundaries of gender and sexuality, accusations could be deadly. A man practicing Seder might be labelled unmanly, accused of passivity, or connected to taboos that undermined his honour. Yet at the same time, fertility charms and erotic magic circulated widely. Archaeological finds of amulets carved with runes often include inscriptions tied to love or sexual potency. It created a strange paradox. You could be shamed for the wrong kind of intimacy, but celebrated for wielding magic that enhanced desire, as long as you performed it within cultural rules. The absurdity becomes clear when you realise how specific some taboos were. One saga describes a dispute settled not by swords, but by accusations about the positioning of partners in bed. Another recounts insults about who had ridden whom, phrased in ways meant to publicly humiliate the accused. These were not private jokes. They were community-shaking scandals, recorded in verse and carried into memory like scars. Reputation mattered so much that the Vikings weaponized even the mechanics of intimacy as grounds for shame. The law codes back this up. In the Icelandic Gragas, the medieval collection of laws, sexual insults appear alongside rules about theft and property disputes. To accuse a man of being a mare, a goat, or otherwise sexually deviant was treated with the same seriousness as accusing him of robbery. The punishment. In some cases, death was on the table, because the accusation itself implied such a severe break in social fabric. Imagine standing in a law court surrounded by chieftains and neighbours, defending yourself not against murder, but against the rumour that you were not properly masculine in bed. And yet, beneath the severity, there was also laughter. Viking humour was sharp, bawdy, and relentless. Erotic jokes filled the margins of skaldic poetry, loaded with double meanings and thinly veiled references to fertility. To be the butt of such humour was dangerous, but to wield it skillfully was a mark of intelligence. A skald could ruin reputations with a single cleverly phrased verse, and communities remembered these lines for generations. Sexuality was not just biological, it was cultural ammunition, wrapped in poetry and sharpened with wit. What strikes modern readers is the sheer weight these rituals of shame carried. A misplaced insult could kill, a whispered accusation could topple alliances. The act itself mattered less than the interpretation. What counted was whether the community believed the story, whether honour cracked under pressure, and whether the gods frowned on the pollution of taboo spaces. The sensory details bring it to life. The smoke of a law court fire curling into the air, the stench of sweat as dozens packed into a longhouse to hear accusations, the heavy silence before a skald delivered a biting verse. Reputation was fragile and intimacy was always on trial. But even with prohibitions circling like wolves, fertility still had to be celebrated, managed, and controlled. Which brings the focus to another domain where Viking sexuality became ritualized, exaggerated, and bizarre. The world of magical charms, protective runes, and fertility idols was not just tolerated. It was essential. Viking society treated intimacy not just as a biological necessity, but as a field ripe for supernatural intervention. Where we might expect flowers, wine, and awkward small talk, the Norse reached for runestones, carved talismans, and whispered spells designed to bend desire to their will. To them, love could be manufactured, lust could be summoned, and fertility could be commanded with the right combination of wood shavings, blood, and chanting. These were not fringe practices either. Archaeological finds and sagas alike confirm that erotic magic was woven tightly into daily life, offering both hope and horror in equal measure. Runes were the first weapon in this magical arsenal. They were not merely an alphabet. They were symbols thought to contain the raw power of creation itself. Some runes carried meanings tied to fertility, desire, and potency. The rune luggies, associated with water and flow, was sometimes invoked in love charms. The rune berkanan, symbolising birch and fertility, was carved into objects meant to encourage conception. Archaeologists have uncovered wooden sticks etched with runic inscriptions that scholars believe were tied to erotic magic. One notorious find from Bergen, Norway, contains runes that translate into an explicit plea for love and sexual submission, written with all the subtlety of a medieval dating app gone feral. But runes were only the beginning. The Vikings also employed physical charms, often small figurines or amulets carved in ways that emphasized exaggerated fertility symbols. Tiny phallic pendants appear in burial contexts across Scandinavia, suggesting that these items were considered powerful protectors against infertility. To carry one was not considered obscene. It was practical, a portable insurance policy against impotence or barrenness. The absurdity is difficult to miss. Imagine walking into a Viking longhouse, noticing the firelight glinting off a row of carved pendants hanging from the rafters, each one proclaiming loudly that someone inside took their reproductive health very seriously. And then there were the spoken spells, whispered incantations designed to ensnare the heart or body of the target. Seder, the sorcery often practiced by women, included branches of erotic magic. A practitioner might chant over a drink, ensuring that whoever consumed it would become hopelessly smitten. Other charms were more direct, calling upon gods like Freya or Freya, deities of love and fertility, to intervene directly in human affairs. These rituals blurred the line between desire and coercion. If you suddenly found yourself falling in love after drinking ale brewed by a neighbour's daughter, you could never quite be sure whether your heart was speaking or whether you had been ensnared by magic. The saga literature does not shy away from describing these practices in all their uncomfortable detail. In Egil's saga, there is a notorious account of a failed love spell. A young woman, desperate to secure the affection of a man, commissions a sorceress to carve runes and place them under his bed. Instead of falling in love, the man becomes gravely ill, nearly dying before the runes are discovered and destroyed. The lesson was clear. Erotic magic was potent but dangerous, a high-risk gamble where the wrong symbol or poorly carved line could transform seduction into sickness. Fertility rituals extended beyond individuals and into the agricultural cycle itself. Fields were sometimes blessed with symbolic acts meant to encourage growth, blurring the line between human and crop fertility. Scholars debate whether couples were ever expected to copulate in the fields as a way of magically fertilizing the soil. The evidence is inconclusive, but references to symbolic acts of fertility tied to planting seasons suggest that at least some rituals linked human intimacy with agricultural abundance. In other words, your love life might be judged not just by your in-laws, but by the state of the barley harvest. The gods themselves modelled these rituals. Freyr, the god of fertility, is often depicted in a state of exaggerated potency. At Uppsala in Sweden, medieval chroniclers described a cult statue of Freyr so proudly endowed that it startled visiting Christians. Devotion to this god involved offerings meant to ensure both human and agricultural fertility. While much of the detail has been lost, later records describe rituals where phallic symbols were paraded, honoured, and implored to guarantee abundance. Imagine the awkward solemnity of a religious procession centered around what looks like the world's least subtle fertility mascot. There is also the question of sacred marriage. Some scholars argue that Viking ritual may have included symbolic unions between humans and gods, ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour. While evidence is scarce, the idea appears in comparative Indo-European traditions. If it occurred in Scandinavia, it would have been yet another layer of intimacy elevated to the cosmic stage, turning what we might see as private acts into performances of spiritual significance. The humour, of course, lies in the extremes. Here was a culture that treated certain sexual insults as grounds for death, and yet simultaneously decorated their homes and temples with fertility idols so blatant they make modern museum curators blush. Here was a people who feared the pollution of taboos, but who also trusted carved sticks of wood to ignite irresistible passion. The contradictions were endless, and they reveal a society where sex was never simply sex. It was a force tangled in lore, magic, humour, and survival. Picture the sensory overload. The scent of resin as runes are carved into wood, the clatter of amulets jingling against a belt, the low chant of a sorceress weaving words into a drinking horn. Picture the nervous anticipation of the victim, sipping ale unaware of the spell humming inside it, or the farmer watching the clouds, hoping the fertility rites carried out in the spring fields would translate into a good harvest. Sexual rituals were not hidden indulgences, they were woven into the rhythm of life itself, and yet, even these magical interventions were never entirely safe. Every spell risked backfiring. Every ritual teetered on the line between reverence and ridicule. The sagas remind us that when erotic magic failed, it could destroy reputations, ignite feuds, or invite divine wrath. In Viking society, nothing was more dangerous than tampering with desire. The strangest part of all is how little separation there was between intimacy and the cosmic order. In the Viking worldview, human fertility was inseparable from the fertility of fields, herds, and even the gods themselves. A spell to increase desire was not just about pleasure, it was about survival, legacy, and the stability of communities. Erotic magic, bizarre as it seems to us, was a logical extension of a world where every aspect of life had to be managed, negotiated, and blessed. And so, from burial rites to magical runes, from public insults to fertility idols, Viking sexuality emerges as a vast tapestry of contradictions. It was sacred and profane, serious and comedic, terrifying and absurd all at once. It demanded attention because it shaped not only personal relationships but entire communities, crops, and even divine favour. Which leads directly into the next unsettling subject. If erotic magic shaped love and fertility, then seasonal festivals magnified them, blending feasting, sacrifice, and sexuality into events so extravagant they shocked outsiders and scandalised priests. If you thought intimacy in Viking society belonged only to smoky longhouses and whispered spells, you have underestimated just how public these rituals could become. Entire communities sometimes turned their attention to fertility, weaving sexuality directly into the seasonal festivals that mark the Viking year. The goal was simple. If humans were fertile, then the fields would be fertile, the herds would multiply, and the gods would be pleased. And to achieve that, Vikings were willing to perform ceremonies that startled their neighbours and baffled later chroniclers. At the heart of these rituals was the god Freya, the divine embodiment of fertility, prosperity, and agricultural abundance. Freya was no subtle deity. His representations often emphasized exaggerated sexuality, with medieval writers describing cult statues that left Christian observers aghast. At Uppsala, Adam of Bremen, a German cleric writing in the 11th century, described sacrifices to Freya in a grand temple. These ceremonies involved offerings of crops, animals, and in some accounts even humans. But beyond the blood and feasting, Freya's cult centered around ensuring fertility in every sense of the word. Phallic symbols were carried and honored, some so prominent that they became the focal point of seasonal celebrations. Archaeologists have uncovered clues that suggest these rituals were not only symbolic. Certain phallic stones, placed in public spaces, may have served as sacred markers where offerings were made. Some were smeared with substances thought to increase potency, turning them into both religious icons and community fertility insurance. To modern eyes, the solemn procession of villagers parading around a carved stone shaped like an enormous phallus may seem like parody, but to the Vikings it was a logical plea for divine intervention in matters of survival. Feasting played its role as well. The blot, a sacrificial feast, often coincided with moments when fertility was most critical. Midwinter blots, for instance, were held to encourage the return of the sun and the renewal of life. Some scholars suggest these events included ritualized intimacy, or at least gestures toward it, as a way of symbolically enacting the fertility of the coming year. Imagine an entire community gathered in a longhouse, firelight flickering, the air heavy with roasted meat and spilled ale, while fertility charms jingled on belts and toasts were raised to Freya. The boundaries between sacred ritual, drunken feast, and sexual display blurred into one cacophony of devotion and indulgence. Even planting seasons could be accompanied by symbolic acts. There are hints in folklore that women might straddle freshly tilled fields, symbolically seeding the earth with their presence. While the evidence is fragmentary, parallels from other Indo-European traditions suggest that Viking fertility rituals may have included such theatrical performances. In this worldview, the human body was not just private, but an active participant in cosmic renewal. The absurdity becomes clear when you imagine it in detail. Farmers anxiously watching the sky, while hoping that their neighbour's fertility pantomime in the field might coax the gods into sending good weather. The seasonal cycles gave rhythm to these practices. Spring festivals emphasised renewal, often with fertility rites at their core. Summer brought ceremonies that blended sexuality with abundance, ensuring herds would fatten and crops would ripen. Winter festivals were more desperate, a way to plead for the return of light and warmth. Each season offered another chance to tie human sexuality to the survival of the entire community, and at every turn the rituals could become bizarrely theatrical. The humour is impossible to miss. On one hand, these were deeply serious ceremonies tied to the survival of Viking families and farms. On the other, they involved props and performances that to modern eyes resemble something between a college prank and an avant-garde theatre show. Phallic idols smeared with offerings, chants invoking deities of love, and the occasional symbolic coupling of humans and soil created spectacles that were part festival, part fertility experiment. Outsiders were shocked. Christian writers who visited Scandinavia recoiled at what they saw, often describing it with a mix of horror and disgust. To them, these rituals were not only sinful but laughable. Yet within Viking culture, they were expressions of profound reverence, ways to ensure that life itself would continue in an environment where survival was never guaranteed. What seems bizarre to us was sacred necessity to them. Picture the atmosphere at one of these festivals. Torches crackling in the winter dark, mead horns raised high, the sound of chanting punctuated by the bleating of animals waiting to be sacrificed. A carved statue of Freya looms at the centre, gleaming in the firelight, its exaggerated fertility making its purpose unmistakable. Around it, worshippers move in rhythmic patterns, offering ale, bread, and sometimes more unusual tokens tied to fertility. The mingling of smoke, sweat, and anticipation fills the longhouse, or the sacred grove. It was part party, part prayer, and part awkward communal intimacy experiment. The sagas occasionally allude to such festivals in ways that confirm their intensity. In Hervarar saga, a chieftain is mocked for failing to honour Freya properly, a slight that could bring disaster on crops and kin. In Lokasenna, Loki taunts the gods with accusations of sexual impropriety, revealing how central these rituals were to Norse identity. Even myth itself became a stage where sexuality and ritual collided, reflecting the importance of these ceremonies in shaping the Viking worldview. What makes these festivals even more fascinating is how they reveal the practical concerns beneath the spectacle. Fertility rituals were not indulgences, they were strategies for survival, performed in a world where a failed harvest meant hunger and child mortality was brutally high. Sexuality was elevated to ritual because it was inseparable from continuity. The exaggeration, the idols, the bizarre performances all served to reinforce one desperate hope, that life would go on. And yet, as with erotic magic, the risks were never far away. Rituals could fail, crops could die, and communities could interpret these outcomes as signs of divine displeasure. This created pressure to perform the ceremonies exactly right, to honour the gods with the proper blend of sacrifice, sexuality and spectacle. A single mistake could doom a village. This weight gave the bizarre performances an undercurrent of fear, even as they looked absurd from the outside. In the end, Viking fertility festivals remind us that sexuality in their world was not private indulgence but public performance. It was a shared act of survival, celebrated with feasts, sacrifices, and sometimes shocking rituals that made intimacy a cosmic concern. To them, it was life itself staged before the gods. To us, it looks like a bewildering theatre of fertility. If you enjoyed this little journey into historical suffering, check out some of my other videos. There's no shortage of terrible things humanity has put itself through, and I promise they're all equally revolting and oddly relaxing. And let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Do you prefer castles, cavemen, or catastrophes? I always love seeing where you'd like me to drag history's dirty laundry out next. Now close your eyes, let the absurdity fade into background noise, and may your dreams be free of sagas, straw mattresses, and suspicious buckets.